This is a podcast for History Level 2B, the making of modern societies, people, ideas and things. My name is Lynn Abrams, and in this podcast I aim to introduce you to some of the approaches to analysing personal testimony. The podcast is in two parts, and you should listen to both of them. Part 1 is an introduction to the types of personal testimony and goes on to discuss the theory of intersubjectivity. Part 2 discusses memory and narrative as interpretive frameworks or models. This is Part 1, Personal Testimony. In your seminars, you will be discussing and analysing a variety of forms of personal testimony. These may include oral history, autobiography, diaries, and letters. The purpose of the seminars are to introduce you to, firstly, the different forms of personal testimony that may be used as historical evidence. Second, the methodological approaches employed by historians in using this kind of evidence. And thirdly, some of the theoretical models that historians use to analyse these kinds of sources. What is personal testimony, though? It is any kind of evidence that is produced by an individual that purports to present personal experience. This may take the form of a written and sometimes published autobiography, a diary, a letter, a series of letters, an oral history interview, or perhaps a confession or even a witness statement. The time period covered by the testimony may vary between a single event and a lifetime. The content, likewise, may be concentrated on a particular experience or may range across the entire life course. Some historians would argue that personal testimony offers us a more direct route to personal experience, otherwise known as subjectivity, without mediating intervention. And this distinguishes this kind of source from most others we use, such as government records and those produced by institutions, such as the church or the legal system. And indeed, this is why personal testimony is so valuable to historians. It allows us to see into the individual's psyche, sometimes known as subjectivity. However, no personal testimony is produced in a vacuum. It is not free of the context in which it is produced. All forms of testimony, whether an oral history interview or a diary, are constructed in relation to cultural norms and discourses. These norms shape the form taken by the testimony, the language, metaphors and ideas used by the individual in creating the text, and the ways in which he or she creates a narrative or story, drawing on certain available models. There may also be secondary questions about authenticity or veracity, about the author's intent, and about interventions between the author and the published or unpublished text. In order to be able to analyse these kinds of sources, then, we need the tools to understand why and how they were produced and what they mean. In what follows, I will briefly outline some of the methodological and theoretical approaches used by historians to think about personal testimony. You will find it easier to understand and appreciate the utility of these approaches if you have already consulted some personal testimony sources, whether that be an oral history interview, a diary, autobiography, or correspondence in letters. You can find links to a range of sources on the course Moodle. I will now introduce you to three key theoretical approaches which are applicable to all of the personal testimony sources you are likely to consult for this course. And in this part 1, I'm going to talk about intersubjectivity. In part 2, I will talk about memory and narrative. Intersubjectivity. This refers to the relationship between two or more subjectivities or individual identities and outlooks on the world in the production of a shared narrative. This theoretical approach is most germane to the context of the oral history interview, because in this form of testimony there are two subjectivities who share or cooperate in the production of the story or narrative. That is, the interviewer and the interviewee. The interpersonal dynamics of the interview scenario, which may be influenced by the gender, age, and personality of both parties, has an effect on the resulting narrative. So we must always be aware of the two-way conversation in words, in gestures, and in deeds that produces an oral history narrative. But as well, the interviewee is also engaged in a dialogue or conversation with culture. This means that he or she draws on discursive formulations or recognizable archetypes or public identities in order to construct a version of the self with which he or she is comfortable. For example, the good citizen, the black sheep, the conscientious worker. Oral historian Penny Summerfield's words are helpful here. She says, quote, "It is thus necessary to encompass within oral history analysis and interpretation not only the voice that speaks for itself, but also the voices that speak to it." The theory of intersubjectivity is also useful when analysing other forms of personal testimony such as diaries and autobiography. All narrators are engaged in an intersubjective dialogue with culture, which means that the texts they produce are only understandable if we know something of that culture, its dominant or acceptable models of behaviour and ways of thinking. So, for instance, diaries written in the Western world at any time before the late 19th century are likely to contain frequent references to religion. Autobiographies tend to follow a script defined by what our culture regards as success or achievement. Many historians have found the concept of composure helpful in understanding how people construct memory stories that cohere with wider culture. Composure refers to the individual's ability to tell a coherent story with which he or she feels comfortable. The narrator is more likely to be able to achieve composure if the memory story can be situated within a publicly recognised set of values.